Imagine a longtime Windows user sitting in front of their computer, finger hovering over the mouse, staring at a freshly installed Linux desktop for the very first time. There's a mix of curiosity, excitement, and a quiet fear that something is about to go very wrong. For years, Windows has been the default, the familiar routine, the thing that came pre-installed and therefore became normal. Now the screen looks different. The start menu isn't where it usually is, the icons have a slightly unfamiliar style, and there's a subtle realization setting in. This system is not asking for permission in the same way Windows does. This moment is where the real story begins, because what happens when Windows users actually try Linux is not just about software, it's about habits, expectations, frustrations, and sometimes genuine surprise. At first, most Windows users approach Linux defensively. They expect it to be difficult. They've heard stories, usually exaggerated, about black terminals, cryptic commands, and systems that break if you look at them the wrong way. So when the desktop loads, and it looks normal, there's a pause. Wait, that's it. The mouse moves, windows open, applications launch smoothly, and suddenly the first assumption is challenged. Linux doesn't immediately punish beginners. In fact, many modern Linux distributions go out of their way to feel welcoming, familiar, and even comfortable to someone coming straight from Windows. This is often the first shock. Linux is not what they were warned about. Then comes the second surprise: speed. On the same hardware where Windows took its time booting up, Linux often feels instantly responsive. The system boots faster, applications open quicker, and there's an overall feeling of lightness. Windows users notice this almost immediately, especially those on older laptops or budget PCs. That machine they thought was slow because it's old suddenly feels reborn. This is usually where curiosity turns into genuine interest. The question shifts from why would anyone use this, to why doesn't my Windows machine feel like this? But comfort doesn't last long without friction. As soon as Windows users start doing real work, small differences begin to surface. Installing software, for example, is one of the earliest culture shocks. Windows users are used to searching the web, downloading an installer, clicking next 5 times, and hoping they didn't accidentally install extra junk. On Linux, the idea that there's a central software store, curated and integrated into the system, feels strange at first. Some users love it instantly, others are suspicious. Why can't I just download the program from the website? They ask. And when they do, sometimes it doesn't work the way they expect. This is often the first point of frustration. Then there's the terminal. Even though many Linux desktops barely require it anymore, the terminal has a presence. Tutorials mention it. Forum answers reference it. And Windows users, especially non-technical ones, feel intimidated. The terminal represents a loss of safety. On Windows, mistakes feel reversible. On Linux, the idea of typing commands feels powerful and dangerous. Ironically, many Windows users later discover that the terminal is one of Linux's greatest strengths. But that realization comes later, after fear slowly gives way to curiosity. Another moment that defines the experience is hardware support. For some Windows users, everything works perfectly out of the box. Wi-Fi connects instantly, Bluetooth works, sound plays, and displays scale properly. For others, something doesn't. Maybe the Wi-Fi driver is missing, or the touchpad behaves strangely, or a printer refuses to cooperate. This is often the most critical turning point. When Linux works flawlessly, users feel empowered. When it doesn't, frustration sets in fast. Windows users are accustomed to drivers magically appearing through Windows Update. On Linux, the idea that you might need to manually enable or install something feels unfair, even if the process is simpler than expected. As users spend more time on Linux, they start noticing philosophical differences. Linux doesn't nag in the same way. There are no forced updates suddenly rebooting the system. No pop-ups asking them to sign into an online account. No constant reminders about subscriptions or cloud services. This silence is both refreshing and unsettling. Some users love the feeling of control. Others feel oddly unsupported, like something is missing. Windows has trained users to expect a certain level of interference, and Linux breaks that pattern. Privacy is another slow realization. Windows users often don't think much about telemetry until it's gone. On Linux, There's a sense that the system is not watching, not reporting, not constantly communicating with the central authority. For some, this feels liberating. For others, it feels irrelevant. But over time, many users start appreciating the idea that their operating system exists to serve them, not to collect data about them. This is rarely an instant conversion moment. It's more like a gradual shift in mindset. Customization is where many Windows users truly get hooked. At first, they might just change the wallpaper or adjust the theme. Then they realize they can move panels, change window behavior, install different desktop environments, or even make the system look almost identical to Windows if they want. This freedom can be overwhelming. Windows users are used to customization within strict boundaries. Linux removes many of those boundaries, and with that freedom comes responsibility. Some users love it and dive deep. Others get lost and wish someone had told them where to stop. Gaming is often the big question mark. For years, Windows users believed Linux simply wasn't an option for gaming. When they try it now, especially with modern compatibility tools, they're surprised. Many games work, some even run better, and the experience is far from the nightmare they imagined. Still, not everything works perfectly. Anti-cheat systems, specific launchers, or niche games can cause issues. This creates a mixed emotional response: excitement that gaming is possible, frustration that it's not universally seamless. For some, this is a deal breaker. For others, it's a minor inconvenience. Workflows also change. Windows users accustomed to Microsoft Office might struggle with alternatives. Files open slightly differently, shortcuts aren't identical, and collaboration can feel awkward at first. This is where Linux users either adapt or retreat. Those who stay begin to realize that Linux isn't about copying Windows exactly. It's about offering different ways to work. Once that mental shift happens, productivity often increases. But until then, there's resistance. Over time, something subtle but powerful happens. Windows users start learning how their system actually works. They begin to understand file systems, permissions, updates, and processes in a way they never did on Windows. This knowledge builds confidence. Tasks that once felt mysterious become logical. Problems feel solvable rather than magical. This is one of Linux's quietest but most impactful effects. It turns users into participants instead of passive consumers. Of course, not everyone stays. Some Windows users try Linux for a few days, hit a wall, and go back. This isn't failure. It's part of the reality. Linux is not designed to please everyone, and it doesn't try to be. For users who expect it to behave exactly like Windows, disappointment is almost guaranteed. But for those willing to adapt, the rewards are significant. There's also a social aspect. Windows users entering the Linux world often encounter communities that are different from what they're used to. Forums, chat rooms, and documentation are abundant, but the tone can vary. Sometimes it's welcoming and patient. Sometimes it's blunt and technical. This can be intimidating, especially for beginners. But for those who push through, these communities become a source of learning and empowerment. Helping yourself becomes part of the culture. After weeks or months, many Windows users experience a strange moment when they boot back into Windows. It feels heavier, slower, more restrictive. Things they once ignored now stand out. The ads, the forced updates, the constant background activity. This doesn't mean Linux has ruined Windows forever, but it does change perception. Once you've experienced an alternative, the default no longer feels inevitable. At the same time, Linux reveals its own flaws. Software availability can still be an issue. Professional tools, proprietary applications, and industry-specific software may not exist or may require workarounds. This is often the final deciding factor. For users whose work depends on specific Windows-only tools, Linux becomes a secondary system rather than a replacement. And that's okay. Linux doesn't demand exclusivity. Eventually, the story splits into different paths. Some Windows users become full-time Linux users, wondering why they didn't switch sooner. Others use Linux alongside Windows, appreciating the strengths of both. Some leave and never look back, concluding that Linux isn't for them. But almost all of them leave with something valuable: perspective. They now know that Windows is not the only way computing can work. What really happens when Windows users try Linux is not a dramatic instant conversion or total rejection. It's a process. It's confusion turning into understanding, fear turning into curiosity, and assumptions being challenged one by one. Linux doesn't just offer a different operating system. It offers a different relationship with technology. And whether users accept or reject that relationship, the experience itself changes how they see their computers forever. In the end, Linux doesn't need to replace Windows to make an impact. It only needs to be tried. Because the moment a Windows user realizes that their computer can be faster, quieter, more respectful, and more under their control, something shifts. Even if they go back, they'll never see Windows the same way again. And that, more than anything, is what truly happens when Windows users actually try Linux.